All right. This one, I think it's important to understand that the very, 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 very basic element of literary theory has to be taken into account here. I am not a literary theorist. I'm a generalist by nature when it comes to um, my levels of expertise. But I do think that in any literature class that one goes through, it's important to think about the fact that there are several ways of looking at any given piece of literature. And I think it's important to think about how the way we look at that literature affects our reading of that literature. And the fact that somebody who holds a certain theory about how literature should be read or how literature should be experienced might have a different reaction to that literature, a different experience than somebody who is a formalist and is just looking for the symbols and the irony and focusing only on symbols and irony and all the lit terms you had to memorize in high school. I'm going to begin with a quick thing that was taught to me back in the day and gave me a way to think about literary theory. There was a guy named Abrams who had a book called The Mirror and the Lamp. It was about art, not just literature, but art in general. But the way it was taught to me, it makes perfect sense that it can apply here. You have the literary work or the artistic work. You have the audience or the readers. You have the artist or the author. And you have the universe that spawned the work. And in the case of literature, sometimes you have a universe inherent inside the work. And I know we talked about the idea that magic in a fantasy novel has to follow the rules of that fantasy universe. If magic always comes with a price, then you can't have a one time when it doesn't. So the universe that produced the work, as well as the universe inside the work, are important. Formalism is the one that I mentioned at the start. Formalism is the one that I think high school teachers earn their money with. We're going to look at diction. We're going to look at metaphors. We're going to look at symbols. I'm recording this just after teaching paper towns, and Q talks about there's no shortage of metaphors. We're always looking for them. It might deal with the plot at a simple level, certainly going to talk about characterization, and how is this story told? First person, third person, is it a stream of consciousness effort? Formalism lives and dies by those things, and formalism is always, always, always concerned with the work first. The work matters. The work contains the symbols. The work produces the irony. It's the diction within the work that sets up the metaphor. Formalism is about the work. The reader, the ideal reader for formalism, is one who understands all of these literary devices. Biographical emphasizes the relationship between the author and his or her literary work. So biographical, by its very nature, emphasizes the artist, emphasizes the author. And so people are always looking for what happened in the author's childhood to cause him to write this darkness. What happened, as this writer was in his 7th year of alcoholism to all of a sudden produce brand new poetry. Those sorts of things are all biographical. If you had a high school teacher who asked you to research the author's life, they were engaging in biographical criticism. What was in the author's life, and how does it connect to his or her literary work? The psychoanalytical and Freudian, I think it's safe to say that a lot of times this is about sex. This is about the unconscious impulses and desires and feelings that influence motions and behavior. One of the best examples I ever saw, and I can't remember where I saw it, was in the example of Hamlet. Hamlet is told by his father's ghost to take revenge on Claudius. But Hamlet dithers and waits and doesn't do anything. The psychoanalytical or the Freudian will say, well, it's because of the Oedipal complex. Claudius is doing what Hamlet wants. He killed the father and he's marrying the mother. That's what, according to Freud, every male goes through that Oedipal cycle. And because of that, Hamlet has a tough time getting revenge on somebody who's doing what he wants to. He's not seeing it as a murder. He's not seeing it as a form of adultery. He is seeing it as an act that he wants to engage in. That would be a Freudian reading of that. And again, it's all about the hidden impulses. What's in the human conscious? Okay. With Q, how many of his impulses for Margot, his actions were driven by this hidden desire to be a knight in shining armor, for example. Marxism. I realize we're in an election year, and I realize that there are people screaming that Marxists are coming to take over the world and that we can't become a socialist country. This has nothing to do with that. This focuses on the ideological content of the work. And what are the underlying assumptions about culture, about race, about class, and about power? Marxism, in a lot of ways, is being used by people across the political spectrum. The conservative critic who says that liberals are indoctrinating children and then pulls examples from textbooks is engaged in Marxist criticism. It is looking at the explicit and implicit assumptions of a text and what does it say about culture or class or power or any of those, sexuality, whatever. And so I think it's important to look at the fact that Marxism is the broad name for this. And yes, Marxists have different views of power than literary historians or any other sort of historical criticism. They might have certain specific views about culture or class, and they may want those views expressed, or they may say that those views, if those views are not expressed, then this is not a good book. This is a book that should be avoided. Whereas somebody who has a different view about power or culture or race might like the book, but they're using the same tools. They're questioning the underlying assumptions about culture or race or class or power inherent within the book. I kind of did a Marxist criticism by talking about first world problems. Are the people in paper towns too concerned about first world problems? Living in that subdivision, having lots of money, those sorts of things, I think, would be questions a Marxist critic would ask. Literary historicism moves beyond the facts of the author's personal life and looks at the currents in which the author composed the work. They may make connections with other literary works that influence the author. For example, Leaves of Grass, that was in paper towns, was a revolutionary work when one considers the other poets of the time period. And one might look at Emily Dickinson and see whether she was influenced by Leaves of Grass or other Whitman sorts of work. And it probably also looks at some of the bigger social intellectual currents that are happening in colleges and universities and how that changes the way the writer writes or how that changes literature of the time period itself. In addition to that, you have cultural criticism. And cultural criticism includes works that aren't necessarily in the literary canon, that aren't necessarily great works of literature, and takes a look at how they may have influenced what is written down and the popular manifestation of context. I think cultural criticism might look at paper towns and being written in 2008, just before a big election, just before the economy crashed, and take a different look at that book and why it's important and how that book might have been influenced by what was going on in 2006, 2007, leading up to 2008, um, in a way that a Marxist or a literary historian would not. The cultural critics are going to look at those manifestations, plus all of the cultural components that got tossed to the work, the Wilco song, the Woody Guthrie things, the T-shirts from the gas station. All of those things would be stuff that cultural critics will look at and decide whether the work is dealing with those elements honestly. Finally, post-colonial criticism. Florida, to the best of my knowledge, was never colonized, at least not in the sense that it would affect paper towns. You might argue that it was colonized by the Spanish and English as they moved the Native Americans out. That's a different discussion. Post-colonial, however, impacts, I think, greatly on A Long Way Gone. That nation was colonized. That nation did experience colonial control, and then the withdrawal of colonial control. And you need to take a look at what effect that had on the broader culture that produced the Civil War, that produced the culture that allowed for the boy soldiers. A post-colonial critic would focus on a lot of that in A Long Way Gone, or a lot of that in any book that was fiction but contained elements of boy soldiers. One of the books I've enjoyed reading and teaching was, I just lost the title as I'm doing my one-take thing, Things Fall Apart. Things Fall Apart was written in the 1940s. It chronicles the effects of colonial Britain on an African nation. And the effect on one of the characters who was one of the great men of the village, and how he had a tragic downfall because of the actions of colonialism in part, as well as his own actions, as well as his own actions. Let's see if I can go to the next slide without stammering so much. The feminist critics. They're going to look at what are the images of the women in the literature? Do these women relish the patriarchal control, or do they struggle against it? Do they show how women have been impeded in their efforts to gain equality? For example, across my Instagram feed last week, somebody threw in a series of stats about how women pay almost $1,000 a year more for toiletries than men do, that women's razors cost more than men do, that women's shampoo costs more than shampoo marketed to men, that deodorant for women costs more than deodorant for men. A feminist would look for those sorts of things to be placed in the book and to show how women can fight against a patriarchal control. And again, I think a feminist would look at, where is Margot on this thing? Are we perhaps downplaying Margot in Paper Towns and not giving her own story by focusing everything on Q and his efforts? Does that somehow denigrate Margot as a character? Those would be questions feminists would have. Even the numbers, why are there way more guys than women? Why are a couple of the women merely there to be, looked at as objects for sex or something like that? What would a feminist do with a character like Ben, who seems to be painted as somebody we should like, whom Lacey falls in love with or lust with and calls him a very great but very inappropriate boyfriend? What would a feminist critic do with things like that? The reader response, I have a love-hate relationship with. I think the reader response is important because it does point out that if you're reading this book for the first time, you're having a different response than a person who is reading it for the third time. it calls out the fact that I, as a 62-year-old, am going to have a different response than you are as an 18, 19, 20, 21-year-old. All of that, I think, is good. It may call out the fact that I've read too many comic books, you haven't, so I'm always going to look for the heroic quest. All of those things are good. At the same time, I think reader response sometimes fails because it allows people to say that all readings are correct. And I don't think that's possible. I don't think you can go to Paper Towns and say it's about space aliens. I think that there are limits to what's correct and not correct. And I think that reader response sometimes allows those incorrect readings to be held on a par with more relevant readings, for lack of better words, more correct readings. Archetypal. I talked about on the last slideshow with the hero's journey. Archetypal can also be certain kinds of characters, the knight in shining armor. The hard-boiled detective is the same sort of thing. I believe I mentioned Q's code, or he's acting on a code as he goes to search for Margot. The knight had a code as well. Those sorts of things are the archetypal experiences. The trickster, that's an archetypal experience as well. And the trickster, or archetypal character, it's an archetypal character as well. And we'll hit on those as we go. I find archetypal analysis very, very interesting. And so I will dig it in all the time. When we get to the Black Panther, we're certainly going to talk about archetypal analysis as well. Structuralism. I'm going to run through the idea very, very quickly. Structuralism is basically saying that there are opposites that hold the novel together. There are opposites that talk about death and life, for example. There are opposites that talk about young and old. What this slide doesn't tell you is that structuralism believes that these things are hidden deep. This is not a yin and yang sort of thing where the light and the dark are very, very obvious. They want to dig and dig and dig to find just the basics. And then from the basics, determine what the opposites are and go from there. Deconstruction. Deconstruction was the hot thing in the 90s, the early 2000s. I think it still kind of informs a lot of literary theory, although there are things like post-humanism and other things that I'm just not going to get into for the purposes of this slideshow. But I think it's important to understand that it says that we really can't know anything, that language is not precise enough, and so we can't untangle any meaning out of any book. And the efforts to have a didactic message in the book are doomed to fail because language is imprecise. Deconstruction, I think, begins and ends with don't trust the experts and there are no absolutes. It ignores the fact that it is telling you not to trust the experts by claiming we're experts who are telling you not to do this. That seems to me to be a contradiction. It also ignores the fact that saying there are no absolutes creates an absolute. Now, deconstructionists have answers to all of that, and it's always fun to have a nice discussion with them. And yes, language is often imprecise. But I think, again, this is far from my favorite literary theory. One of the things that bothers me about deconstruction is when I have read articles, a lot of times they look at the marginalia, they look at things that are not key to the work itself to draw their conclusions. For them, a footnote is just as important as a topic sentence. And sometimes they're drawing conclusions that are not from the text itself. Once again, I think they offer a service, and that service is that language is imprecise, and that everything cannot be boiled down to simple metaphors. But at the same time, I think they go way too far, as pushing this idea that there is no knowable truth. And again, I've said it several times in other presentations, you'll probably hear me say it in class. Deconstruction turns Western civilization on its head. Socrates and Plato said that the truth was knowable, and they defeated the sophists. Deconstruction is going back and said, truth is not knowable, the sophists were right, and they're turning everything up on its head and turning everything upside down. This is a quick and dirty look at literary theory. I will probably have some open book quiz on literary theory at some point, just to kind of let people know that these are the terms, these are the definitions, these exist. And the main purpose of this is twofold. Number one, to let you know that there are dozens of ways to look at a literary work that don't involve formalism. And number two, to get you ready for the use of the term post-colonial in A Long Way Gone. I think I'm going to wrap this one up for now, and we'll move on to the novel and whatever other presentations I need to have to make the beginning of A Long Way Gone work. Have a good one.